All right, so we're continuing with the 914 5-lug swap. This is the kit that PMB offers that uses re-drilled rear hubs and then re-drilled front rotors. And when you get the kit, it comes with all new rotors, the re-drilled rear hubs, and all new bearings. So the first thing I had to do here on the front end is tear it down. Had to get the brake caliper off, and then the front rotor, which actually has the wheel bearings contained in it. And you can see here, I took the old rotor off, and the bearing just kind of comes out. And you can see the race. This is the outer race of the outer wheel bearing, and then on the back side there's another wheel bearing, but there's also this dust cap. So luckily I don't have to deal with all this stuff because I'm not reusing these rotors. If you were just changing out your wheel bearings, you'd have to take all these out and actually drive out those races. But I don't have to worry about it, so chuck that aside. And so once I get everything cleaned up, I'm ready to install the new bearings in the new rotor from PMB. And in this case here, I've already driven in the inner race. And you can see the bearing's going to go in here, right there, just like that. There's a little curve on this wheel bearing that is going to ride on this curve on the spindle here. So that one's already been installed. And the way I did that is I just got it started slightly into the rotor, and then I got a large impact socket that was just the right size to sit on that outer race, and just kind of gently drove it in. You really have to be careful that it goes in pretty straight, but once it really starts moving in, stays kind of straightens itself out, and there's mostly only one way for it to go in unless it's really gotten screwed up. So that one went in fine. I did put just a little bit of grease on the on the outer race, just to kind of help to get it moving in. And then I've got the outer wheel bearing here, and you can see the bearings fit in here, and this is the race. And this front one, I mean, I think it wouldn't be too difficult to put it in backwards, but there is just a little bit of a bevel on the inside surface here. So obviously you wouldn't want to put it the wrong way. And so it's just kind of starting in right there. And what I'm going to do is I've got a different size impact socket, and I'm just going to see if I can get this to drive in. So I didn't screw it up, so that's good news. So once you drive that race in far enough, there's an inside lip there, and it just kind of seats up against that lip, and you can actually sort of hear the sound of it actually changes a little bit as you're tapping it in. It's kind of got a thicker sound, and all of a sudden when it seats against that metal, it gets a little higher pitched ting to it, so you can listen for that. But also you can just visually look in there to make sure it's seated. And so that's where that outer bearing is going to ride. and then our inner bearing is going to ride here. Okay. Next thing I'm going to do is grease up the inner part of the rotor here. And I'm using some Redline synthetic grease that I used for my Boxster wheel bearings, and should work pretty well in this case, hopefully so. Alright, so I've got a liberal amount of grease in there. Also going to coat the bearing itself. Really trying to work some of the grease into the bearing rollers. This is the inner bearing. Just wiping this down a little bit, and then the last step on the back side here is going to be the cover. Alright, so we got the inner bearing in with the cover, and so now I've got the outer bearing greased up and ready to go. So it just slides into the race, like so. And then I'll put a little extra grease on the spindle here. So now we've got the new rotor drilled for the 5 lugs, obviously. This is actually a 4-lug brake rotor, so it's not a brake upgrade. They keep one of the holes here, that's the factory 4-lug hole, and then they offset 2 right here, and then 2 more right here, and then obviously they're tapped for the new studs that will go in. So we've got the inner wheel bearing with the cover, and I've got the outer wheel bearing in there with the grease, and just slide it onto the spindle here. And then there's this washer here that has a little tab that will slide into the groove on the spindle. So pretty straightforward getting that on there. I want to double check to make sure there's as much grease in there as I can get. And then just slide that washer in, and it's going to kind of push out some of that grease off the flat surface. And then we've got the nut that goes onto the axle. And I mean, you would have discovered all this as you've taken everything apart, but there's a little Allen set screw that goes in. And for now, I'll just kind of hand tighten that. And there it is, one 5-lug brake rotor on the front, ready to go. So I still have to finish off the set screw and put the dust cap back on, and then I'll have to install the extended lugs that I purchased from PMB, and I'll be using red Loctite on the new studs to make sure they are securely locked in place. That's a very important step if you're doing one of the PMB kits, is to use the correct Loctite on the studs, whether they're extended or standard length studs. So that's it for that step. All right, so we've got the other front brake rotor now, and so we need to get the outer bearing installed, and then we'll also do the inner bearing as well. So I'll go ahead and start with this outer bearing. Out of the bearings that come with the PMB kit, it's the smaller of the 2 bearings. And again, if you take a look at the outer race, you can see there's a little taper on the inside. So that is going to help to give you the direction to go into the brake rotor. So I'll put that back together there. So we've got the outer bearing here. This is the smaller of the two. And if you take the bearing out of the outer race, you can see there's a little bit of a taper to the inside surface. So that's going to tell you which direction this is going to go in. And so I'm actually going to leave the bearing out. And again, I used a socket that fit onto, you know, about just slightly smaller than the diameter of the inside race. And I actually used it this way a little bit on the last one, so I might try it again here. And before I tap this outer race in, I'm just going to put a little bit of bearing grease on it, just to make sure that it has a smooth surface to slide on. Again, you know, as you're tapping the race in, you can feel it giving a little bit, and it has sort of a certain sound quality to it. And then as soon as it hits that flange on the inside, you really feel it come to a hard stop, and the sound kind of changes. One benefit also I'm finding for putting just that little bit of grease in there is that as soon as the race comes to rest on that inner flange, it presses out the grease. So it's kind of an extra visual indicator that you have finally seated the race correctly. And bearing just fits in, so that'll be fine. We'll grease that up in a little bit here. Flip the rotor over, and now it's time for the larger inner bearing. Again, removing the bearing, you can see the taper to the inner part of the outer race. So that's going to give you the indication for which direction this race needs to go in. Just a little bit of grease. I'm not really putting very much, just a very light coating on it. And again, using a larger socket to help drive that in place. So we've got the outer race of the inner bearing in place here, and then the bearing's just going to fit. I've got the taper in the right spot. The race is going the right direction. And the last thing that'll go on will be the seal. But before I do the seal, I want to go ahead and pack this bearing with grease to really get as much grease as possible kind of embedded into this bearing all around the bearing rollers. Go ahead and drop the bearing in. Put a little more grease around here just to make sure it's really full. And then the seal goes in. This pretty much can be pressed in by hand. Just use the hammer handle just to get that final seating in place. And since I'm working on the bench, I won't actually do this part yet, but basically I'm going to fill the entire inner surface here, this cavity here, with the bearing grease, and then I'll put in the outer bearing and slide that onto the spindle, and then put the washer and the lock nut on there, and that will be it for this driver's side brake rotor. Now that we have the new wheel bearings installed in the front rotor, I can go ahead and put in the studs. And these were extended studs that I paid some extra for at PMB. because I know eventually the car is going to get GT flares, and probably just at first I'll run the cookie cutter 7-inch cookie cutter wheels that I'm going to put on the narrow body car. Probably run those on the flared car for a while too. So these extended lugs will extended studs will allow me to run probably about a 1-inch spacer, so it should get the offset of the wheels to look pretty good. Alright, so basically I just clamped this the rotor down a little bit on the table here, and I'm going to get started with putting the studs in. The PMB kit didn't come with instructions, at least not any that I saw, but it just took a little quick search on the internet, and I found Apex Performance, and they have a nice write-up on installing threaded studs. And so I'm going to go with their instructions pretty much. And so amazingly, the studs do not actually use much torque. They use 22 to 25 pounds per square inch. But the important thing that has to be done is using red Loctite on the threads that go into either the hub or the brake rotor. And on the PMB website it says to use red Loctite. When I went to the auto parts store, there are actually several different kinds, but I went with 263, which is a high strength Loctite. They also had a high temp, but I think this will do the trick. It hardens in about an hour, and it should have full strength in about 24 hours. Alright, so before I start installing these studs, the first thing I want to do is just give them a little quick spray with brake cleaner. Just enough to make sure the threads are clean. They weren't too bad, just a little bit of light oil on them, probably from the packing or manufacturing process. But I want to make sure that they're nice and clean, and that brake fluid has a minute to flash dry. And then because the style of stud that I ordered from PMB is a bullet nose, I have to use a double nut method to install them. So I've just got a random nut here that's the right thread size. Unfortunately, because I haven't ordered the new nuts that I'm going to use to install the wheels, kind of just had to go with what was around here at the shop. So I found that. And then I found this on my brother's 69 911. So when he wasn't looking, I stole it. And so we'll just double nut it this way. Again, it's not a huge amount of torque on these, so I'm not too worried about my slightly janky setup here. Again, looking at that Apex website, they suggested putting some right on the very end of the stud, but in the case of the rotor here, there's no back to it. It's just a hollow piece going through. So I don't think I need to put any directly on here. I just need to get a couple of good drops on the threads themselves. So I'll just try a little bit here. And they do caution against using too much, so I'm just going to go with a couple of drops there. See how that works. And again, looking at the drilled rotor for the fronts, you'll see one factory threaded hole, and then you'll see 4 new ones that have been cut, drilled, and tapped. And you can really tell those. I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but they're a little bit shiny. Whereas these 3 are the unused remainders from the forelug. So I'm just gonna put one of these in here, and that's pretty good there. See if I can get this tightened up a bit. Alright, so that went in, and then I've got my torque wrench set. I went ahead and set it to 25, which is the higher end of the Apex website recommendations. 22 to 25 is what they said. was holding the wrench on there, so I'm just going to give this a little extra bit here. Keeping an eye on that double stud to make sure, or the double nut, to make sure it's not spinning on the threads. And there it is. Just wipe off that little excess bit of thread locker there. Alright, and there it is. One down, 4 to go. I just want to make sure that that really hit the shoulder. Okay, and the next one. There is one front brake rotor with the 5 lugs, and it seems that I got them all in the right spot, so looks like they're pretty equal. One thing, we're probably just going to time lapse this, the installation of the studs, but you might notice in the time lapse that I came back to this one here, and I had just noticed it hadn't quite gotten down to the shoulder of the stud. So what I did is I actually went a little bit tighter beyond torque, and then it seated down to the shoulder, and then I backed it back out a little bit and then reset the torque. I don't think that will be an issue because the Loctite had only been on there for you know, a minute or so, so hopefully no issues there. But now they all look great. They're all sitting well on the shoulders all the way around on the whole rotor. Wheel bearings are in, so it's ready for installation. Okay, so I've got the passenger side assembly back together, and you know, I had installed all of the extended studs with red Loctite to the proper torque specifications, and at this point this side is completely assembled. The brake assembly is back on. Even the dust cap is in place. I will say that this dust cap was quite a pain to get onto the new rotor. I had to kind of use a tool and kind of whack on it with a hammer to get this to seat all the way around. So, but it's on there and it's not going anywhere. We'll just see what happens the next time I have to take it off. And there it is, ready to go. All right, we're on the driver's side now, and this side is also completely assembled, except I haven't put the dust cap on yet because I just wanted to show you the spindle nut here. I wanted to talk a little bit about this side for those of you who are doing this or even just doing wheel bearings. The driver's side is a reverse thread, so you definitely want to keep that in mind when you're trying to get this off, and also when you're going to put the nut back on. Still need to remember that it's reverse threads, as I found out when I was messing with that, trying to get the threads to start. You don't want this to be super tight, but I was reading up about some people who had set it fairly loose, but then they were still getting some looseness on the front wheels. And then I learned that the trick is to really crank down on this nut. I put an adjustable wrench on it. I had to come in at a little bit of an angle because of the studs already on there. But you can really continue tightening it to take all of that slack out of the wheel bearing assemblies. And so basically I just kept tightening and turning the rotor until I could barely turn the rotor anymore. And then at that point I just backed off the nut a little bit so that I could get a screwdriver in here and just move this washer right here. So once you back that off enough, you can kind of jiggle that washer around and you'll just see it move just a little bit. And so that was the approach I took on both sides, and it seemed to work pretty well. The rotor's moving pretty easily. This has got whatever random tension is on the brake pads right now because I still need to rebleed the system. But there it is. That's the completed front end, other than me putting this dust cap on with some extra grease. And so I'm halfway there to my PMB 5-lug conversion.